Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Family Business Learning Community. For the guests that are among us this morning, I'm Sally Durstein, and I lead our team at the Family Business Center. And presenting alongside me is one of my colleagues, Jared Bias.
Morning.
So while I miss your faces and just having those deeper connections that only face-to-face conversations can bring, I'm deeply grateful that we can continue to connect this way with technology, and also that we can continue with our consulting engagements in our leadership labs through Zoom meetings. Well, over the last 2 months, we've been producing a series of webinars on coping with COVID, and our educational sponsors have been providing really critical updates on that. And they are continuing to stay on top of what's going on with legislation so they can continue to provide us with decision-making opportunities for the health of our businesses and our employees. So continue to check in with on our resource page on that. I'd just like to also name what we're all experiencing, and that is prolonged uncertainty and loss and grief. And we're now in our 7th week, what some are calling a quarantine fatigue. And I do believe that while we will all get through this together, and want you to know that I'm continuing to keep you in my prayers and in my thoughts. Well, today is our first webinar in a series that we're calling Navigating a New Normal. So we're moving through a crisis, and actually the Chinese symbols for crisis translates to a dangerous opportunity. Now we're seeing the danger all around us. That's clear, but there's also opportunity. So today we want to focus on what are the opportunities? How can we manage and own what we can control? How can we continue to build resilience in our families and in ourselves? So 3 things before we get started. Like our other webinars, this one will be on our website along with the slides, so you can look at them again and share them. And secondly, we will be integrating some of our practices and observations with you and other business families over the years into our input today. And lastly, we want to encourage our 30-year practice of community discussions. So we welcome questions. We want you to write them down, though. We likely will not have time for questions on this webinar, but we'll talk about that later at the end about what we're going to do with those questions. So today's topic is roles, boundaries, and resilience in our families. And I'd like to briefly just talk about our mission for the guests that are among us. Our mission is to help business families flourish as individuals, families, and enterprises. So we're all about flourishing as the whole family, as the individuals in a family, and as the business. Now this next slide that's coming up depicts the complexity that you face every day and that I faced growing up. It's really the multiple roles that we are in as family members. 3 different distinct spheres: business, ownership, and family. And actually the values and goals and roles in each are competing, so that it's ripe for confusion and conflict. All those overlapping areas, that's what that is. And so talking about role clarity is very important. Now this next slide depicts our model, the 5-mountain model. Many of you are diligently building and attending to the continuous development of all of your mountains: the family, the management, the shareholder, the board. These are teams, and these are also structures. Some of you on this webinar are in 4 of those mountains. That's really challenging. But today we're going to focus on the family mountain. Now, often the family gets overshadowed by the business. The business just can be a barking dog. It is what it is. It needs attention. It needs energy. So often spouses of a family business can feel like the business is a mistress. I don't know what the male word is for that. And kids can feel like the business is the firstborn. So note that in our model, the family is intentionally the largest mountain. I believe that healthy family is the foundation of a healthy business. So we need to be paying a lot of attention to that. And a healthy family is composed of healthy individuals who know themselves and have clear roles and boundaries. So let's move on, and we are going to first of all address roles. And roles, really naming the reality of how we are functioning in our family. Again, this is on the Family Mountain. So a definition. In a family business, roles are the recurring patterns of behavior by which individuals fulfill family and business functions and needs. So a role is the function assumed by a person. But let's remember, the family is an emotional unit. So it's really hard to not get confused by a lot of the emotions that take place. And when we talk about a family, we are not just talking about blood relatives. We're also talking about first-round draft picks. Now, I know most of you know what that is. That's our name for spouses or the marrieds in. And we call them first-round draft picks because they were selected by the family to join. Normally, we can't control what pops out, but the first-round draft picks are resources. They have outside perspectives, and they can bring them into the family, and they often feel invisible. But we really think it's important to include them in a lot of our Five Mountain process in appropriate ways.
Yeah, so we wanted to just give so that you can start naming, and you see up there again, naming the reality. It's important that we can start having language and understanding what's going on emotionally and functionally, even in our families. So this is an example of some roles that we might play in our family. And I appreciated Sally emphasizing the emotional nature of that, because sometimes that's abstract and it's hard to get our hands around. But these all have impact on other people, but they take energy and emotion to fulfill these functions. So just remember that. Sometimes we think of these like chess where we're just moving pieces around, but this is really about our energy and our emotion. So some of these roles here, the nurturer and the disciplinarian, you'll see we put some of these back to back where they may be on different sides of a spectrum. So a lot of times in the family, we have a nurturer, we have a disciplinarian, the fixer or problem solver, the listener, the go-between or the mediator, the one who plans and organizes and schedules everything. And then the socializer, connector, the one who's out, making connections in the community, the domesticator, the one who's kind of drawing us all back in and making sure we have family dinners and are connecting as a family and not just being so spread out into the community, the emotional manager or emotional laborer, the stabilizer, the one who tends to be just steady as she goes, and then the activator, who tends to maybe be a little more volatile, but they activate new things and get things going. And then I also wanted to put in there the recipient, which sometimes, especially for children, they're the kind of the recipient of all these other functions and roles. So we have to also balance that out. So for me, just as an example, as we start to name some of this, I was thinking about the roles I play in my family. I would say, and they're dynamic. They change over time, which is part of what we'll talk about in terms of resiliency. Is, are we allowing ourselves to change as we learn and grow and as other people learn and grow? So for me, my nurturer role, for whatever reason, in my family has gone up over the years, for sure. And as I've learned to listen more, so my listener role goes up, my fix-it, I'm definitely by nature more of a fixer or problem solver. But as we've learned in our family dynamic, I've kind of lessened that and been more of the listener. So again, it's kind of like learning where we are in our family and being able to name, oh, this is a role that I fill. And it's also important to note with these roles that they're all neutral. So none of these are bad or good roles. They're often appropriate for different times and in different systems with other people. And they can be unhelpful and unhealthy when they get taken to an extreme or they're not right for the system that we're in. So it's important that we can start to have a language for these roles.
So now let's look at some questions to consider about your roles. First of all, what roles are you playing in your family and your business? We have business there in parentheses because it's really, you're never totally away from your role in the other spheres. You can never, now in our diagram, it's nice and clear, those boundaries, but it's always there. It's how to manage that. So I'd like to share an example of a family that I was with a few years ago. It was the CEO and his wife. They had young children. And I was talking with them about the importance of establishing expectations early in life, talked about a family employment policy and things like that. And he shared that he had taken his 5-year-old son to work with him. And his 5-year-old said to his CFO, someday I'm going to be your boss. Now we laugh at that, but there's such truth in that, that we need to address this early, because kids pick up on those messages early, and they can do damage. And another example, let's just go to the next one. Do you feel you have a choice and a voice in the roles you are playing? Now, we are really keen on talking about choice and voice, because it's easy to feel trapped in a family business. Part of that is because we want to be with our parents. We like to follow in their steps. I see that with my granddaughter all the time. She dresses up like mommy and daddy. And so sometimes we want to follow their dream. Sometimes their dream, we can't find our own dream, and so we get trapped in a business. Another example that was almost a missed opportunity, we were with a family, and our first engagement is a base camp where we really listen to every family member. And we said, well, how about your daughter? We noticed her on the family diagram, and they said, well, no, she's not really interested in the business. We don't think that would make sense. And I said, no, that's part of our process. I think this is pretty important. And it was really good that we did that, because she shared with us, even though she was an actress in a big city and they just assumed that's her identity, she shared with us her deep emotional attachment with the business and her hope to be involved in some point. And she was able to express that in a family meeting later on. The next one here, what are ways in which you are under-functioning or over-functioning in relationship to others? Now, this is one where particularly moms get caught in. And I want to start, first of all, that there's a reciprocal reaction with over-functioning and under-functioning. So if I'm over-functioning, those around me can under-function, and vice versa. So moms sometimes get caught in this because, we have fine-tuned fairness radar. And we know what we think we do. Everyone's thinking and feeling, and we want to kind of protect them. We're used to that when the kids are little. But as we get older, we sometimes try to run interference, and we step in and try to speak for or translate between maybe our husband and our children or other family members. It's sometimes a gift we bring, but it actually prevents normal and good conversation between them and development. It can actually stunt development when we do that. I come from a long line of helpers, and one of the things that has really come up for me that I learned actually through Bowen Family Systems Training is, what's the help that helps? And I need to constantly ask myself, my intention is to help, but sometimes I can overfunction.
Sally, just to pile on a little bit, that the language earlier, we talked about that role of emotional manager, and that fits really well here, the emotional laborer, which it basically is defined as when you have to tell family members what to do when it's something they should already know. And I think about that because in a marriage, often too, some spouses, typically it's the wife, who feels like they're the emotional laborer for the family, like telling everyone what to do. And it's like, I told you a million times. And in some ways that seems appropriate for kids, but there's a level at which that becomes inappropriate. And especially for spouses kind of, we've been with families where they joke, like we know they have 4 kids, but they'll say, oh, I have 5 children. And they're including their husband in that list. And that's the emotional laborer. And it's funny because it is often the spouse, but I would say in my family, I'm more of the over-functioner, and that can lead to resentment. And it kind of ties this together where it feels like I don't have a choice, but often that's because I'm choosing to over-function. And I do that because it's hard for me to see my wife or my kids suffer as they learn how to take responsibility or learn how to step into things that they didn't know how to do before. And so it's easier for me just to do it for them. And so I just learn to take responsibility for them instead of letting them kind of fail forward. So, yeah.
Great points, Jared. And the next one, do you feel there's a fair distribution of roles in your family right now? you know, as adults, sometimes we can step into that and say, you know, I think I need to put this role aside, or just have a conversation around that. The next one, have you seen any old patterns or regressions since COVID-19? Well, the reality is, and I'll just name it, is that we're doing all of our many roles in one place. I know we are at my house. You know, my husband's there. He's recently retired from teaching. My daughter, who's trying to study online, and I'm bringing my stuff. So we're renegotiating routines, structures, boundaries. You know, I need the quiet space now, things like that. So maybe you have noticed that as well. Again, it's an opportunity to talk about. And the next slide, we'll move on to practical tips and next steps as far as roles. So one of the things we're suggesting that you can do is write down all the roles you find yourself playing in your family. Write down what gives you energy and what does not give you energy. What roles might you need to give up, take on, or reprioritize? This can be a wonderful experience, and it may be something that you can share in a family meeting. You can call a family meeting, even if you've never had one. We call those family champions, or you can reach out to us as well. The next one, you can work with employed family members, and Jared, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, and the only other thing I would say is if it makes you anxious or nervous to think about reprioritizing and talking about the roles you play and how maybe other people need to take on roles, that's what we're about to get into, which is about boundaries and resilience and how to have those conversations in your family. So yeah, the next part here is writing down in the business clear success profiles, which for us are just clear, so we can be clear about our roles in the business. So it's not just a job description, which is about the job, but this is about the person, helping that every family member that's in the business, and we would argue everyone in the business should have one, but at least every family member knowing what is success. So I can be clear about my role and where I need to step up and what are my responsibilities. So we want to write down that success profile. And then secondly, a functional org chart. And it's interesting that the people in the roles often change when we do this exercise of a functional org chart. So just like roles are about how we function and behave, the business has functions that need to happen as well. And what can happen is one person ends up just kind of taking on more and more roles, and we never go back and rethink, what does the business need in this role? What is the function here that would best be suited? Yesterday, we just had a long meeting with a family in a business where they kept arguing about the president, and we had to step back and say, but what's the function of the president? And once we were able to do that, basically there's a holdover from how grandpa used to do the role, how dad used to do the role, and all these assumptions. And once we just started talking about the behaviors and the practical things that the business needs, we were able to say, oh, well, our president doesn't have to do that. We could put that on this person or this role. And then we were able to spread that out. So work through the functional org chart and then put names in. So we would just encourage you, don't even put names in at all. Don't be thinking, as much as you can, don't be thinking about the who, but only think about the what. And then we can put names in, and that helps build that clarity as well for the roles. And the other thing we just mentioned here is mountainscapes. So we have our 5 mountains. So we don't just think about the business, we think about the whole system and these 5 interrelated teams. So sometimes, and we can send you a blank one of these, but it's just the 5 mountains, the family, the shareholder, the board, management, and advisors, where you can put names in so we can all just in one place see all the roles that we're playing in this family business governance system and how we relate to each other. As Sally said, some people are on 4 of these teams, some people are on 2, and that affects how we see things. So that can be a practical next step too. Good.
Well, we especially see the need for role clarity when stress is high, when lines get blurred, and our balance really gets out of whack. So one way to deal with that is boundaries. So we're going to move on to boundaries now. And how can we find ways to be together without losing ourselves? So a definition I like, and an easy one, is by Henry Cloud in the book Boundaries. By the way, he's got lots of books, including this little one, also Boundaries for Leaders. And it's a boundary shows me where I end and someone else begins. So a simple definition, but really hard. Another thing that he sometimes says is knowing what I am to own and own that responsibility gives me freedom. So sometimes we can think of boundaries as being almost bad. Someone actually in our women's lab last week said that. Aren't boundaries, I get a bad feeling around them, but it's actually a really healthy thing, a good thing. One thing that I think also has been good for me to think about with boundaries, again, I learned through Bowen, is that we are responsible to others and for ourselves. Now, as mothers, we are responsible for our kids often for everything when they're little. But as we get older, part of our responsibility is to teach them responsibility for themselves. And as we move to be adults, we're responsible to others and for ourselves. I'm responsible for my feelings, my side of the street, to be honest about my feelings. I'm not responsible for other people's feelings. Easier said than done. And in family business, this can be especially difficult because of feelings of loyalty and legacy and expectations. So I'd like to share a really good saying that someone from our women's lab said this week, and she gave me permission to share this. So Amber Nielsen, she's G3 from Audubon Land Development. She often shares us words of wisdom that her dad and her grandpa share with her and the rest of the family. And she said, what they say is, what other people think or say about you is none of your business. Isn't that great? I'm going to say it again. What other people think or say about you is none of your business.
Excellent. So the only other thing I would mention around that boundary piece is, you mentioned that some people think it's a negative thing, but by far, when families come to us, one of the things they're looking for is clarity. They're looking for clarity. And that's what boundaries is really about. It's about helping be clear. Where do I begin and end? What are my responsibilities? What are your responsibilities? So boundaries are a great tool for establishing clarity. And we love what Brene Brown says, which is clarity is kindness. It's a way to be kind to each other. And so boundaries can be a way to be kind to one another. Okay, so there's a list of, just because it's an abstract idea, this idea of boundaries, I thought it'd be good to talk about some areas where boundaries might be needed. So we see these quite a bit. So the first one is drive-by verbal vomits, right? So it's not a great picture, a word picture, but it can happen. And if you've been in a family business, I can almost guarantee you've experienced this. We have a family where one of the brothers was just a verbal processor. It just, anything that happened, he had to talk to someone about it. And of course he would talk to his brother who wasn't a verbal processor, who was actually the finance person and was often really deep into the weeds with numbers and trying to keep a lot in his head. And a lot of their conflict, interestingly enough, was just the brother who was a verbal processor would just drop into the office unannounced, sit down in front of his brother and just start processing a verbal vomiting all of the things they were feeling and thinking. And I have to admit, as I thought about this, that can be my problem too. I'm a verbal vomiter at home, which we can see with first round draft picks. And we talk about this in our family meetings. Is first thing I do when I come home and my wife says, how was your day? I have this tendency to just verbal vomit everything, good, the bad, the ugly. And it's kind of like overwhelming for her. For whenever she comes in, she takes on some of that anxiety. So if I have a bad day, she becomes, anxious, and then that just kind of affects everything. So that's kind of the drive-by verbal vomits. The second where boundaries might be needed are relationship triangles. And we're going to talk more in depth about those in a little bit. But one example where that happens, and I tried to come up with one specific case, but this happens so often, I couldn't just leave it to one. But this phrase, let me talk to him first, or let me talk to her first, where a child, one of the kids has a problem with mom or dad, and the spouse wants to step in on behalf of their adult children and say, well, you know how your dad is, or you know how your mom is. Let me talk to him first. I'll kind of prime the pump, or I'll see what's really going on. That may be a good example of where some boundaries might need to happen. And then the last, the third one here is over and under functioning relationships, which is so common. Again, if you take a minute to look at your relationships, I'm sure you'll find places where you're probably over functioning and other relationships where maybe you're under functioning. But especially kind of emotionally where that's happening. One example of this, we had a family where one of the phrases that they often use was, I can't tell him or her the truth because I know he won't take it well. That's what Sally was just talking about. That's a prime phrase for when someone's taking responsibility for someone's emotions. Well, yeah, that's how I really feel, but I don't think I can share that because he won't take it well. And in one extreme case, that he had some mental health challenges, and there was this fear that if we are honest, then he'll end up in the hospital or worse. And so there was a lot of feeling responsible for other people's emotions. So that can be another place. And then the next one is the family CEO. Sally, you want to talk about the family CEO?
Yeah, this one, it's the family CEO is the chief emotional officer. Often it's mom or it might be a spouse. And again, this is mothers often tend to be in the middle, feel like they're between a rock and a hard place, like it's their duty, my duty. And again, we need to give it back and not take that on.
Yeah, and the last place where we might need boundaries is the dinner table. So this comes up a lot, and sometimes it's metaphorical and sometimes it's literally. The dinner table is where, for instance, we talk about business when it's not appropriate. And then the first round draft picks are the spouses who aren't in the business, feel really left out. And so we end up not having a boundary between family and business. And as Sally said, the business becomes the mistress. It becomes the focal point of even the family. And so that can be a good, what are we talking about at the dinner table might be a good thing to reflect on, maybe where there need to be some boundaries.
So now let's move on to defining self without losing our connections. That's a boundary. We want to talk about family patterns that matter. We have enmeshment, detachment, and differentiation of self. Now I'm going to start with differentiation because that's a big word, but what it really means, it's the process of growing up. How can we work on developing our own self, becoming more of a responsible person and permitting other people to be themselves? So some of us come from really families that love to be together. That's a wonderful thing. I come from one of those families, but that can tend to be enmeshed. We can tend to not know who we are in that. And again, want to maybe please other people, not knowing where we begin and where they are. And there are some families that they provide a lot more, they want to put distance in between or detach. So understanding what our family patterns are important so that we can talk about them and work to change them. Again, we're only responsible for ourselves, but one person can change a system.
And to bring that into kind of the emotional realm, I was thinking about how to define these three phrases more emotionally based. And so what I came up with or was thinking about was, enmeshment is when my emotional state depends on yours, right? Another word for that is often codependency. We call that emotional fusion. So when my emotional state depends on you, so however you're feeling, it's going to impact how I'm feeling. That can be that enmeshment in a family. And then the opposite of that is detachment, where when I'm not affected at all by your emotions, they don't impact me in the slightest. I don't give them attention or time of day. It kind of becomes apathy, or I just stop caring. That can be that detachment, which kind of goes the other direction. And then the differentiation of self, of course, is that interdependence, where, yeah, your emotions impact me. I want to know, I'm curious, I'm concerned, but I don't feel responsible for them, and they don't necessarily change how I feel in the moment. So that kind of is maybe a way to think about it, because some of these, again, it's easy to think about like detachment as like physical, like distance, but we're really talking about the emotions that we share within our families. Again, the family as an emotional unit. And then under stress, just thinking through, and I think it's good to be self-aware of what's our pattern under stress. Do we tend to become more codependent? Do we tend to run to someone else and try to live off their emotions? Like, oh, I can't regulate myself, so if you're happy, I want to be around you because you'll make me happy. Or do we tend to detach? So I'm more of a detacher. That's more my natural state under stress. I notice this when I get sick. Some people like to be cared for when they're sick. I can't stand being cared for when I'm sick. Like, leave me alone. Let me be in a dark room by myself, wallow in my own self-pity. I'm just going to detach from all the world. So that's my kind of pattern under stress. So it's good to know that and recognize when that's healthy and not healthy. But the other next thing we wanted to mention is we just call it how we climb. And if you've done any work with us through Basecamp or other consulting, we'll often bring this up from the beginning. And even at our forums, I think we've highlighted this. And it's really a 3-step process that starts with being able to name reality. And that's an important part of setting up a boundary, is being able to name your own reality and how you're feeling. And then once we can sort of set ourselves up that way, then we can enter into this system conversation. We can imagine something new where I don't have to give up myself to be a part of this system. I don't have to lose myself, and I don't have to detach myself. And then we can have some accountability around that. So those are kind of the 3 phases of how we think of setting up boundaries. Is another way of looking at it, is naming our own reality, imagining together this future, and then creating some accountability. All right, before we move on to a little bit more boundaries and resiliency, Sally and I were talking about the importance of putting this part in here, which is sometimes, and I think maybe, I don't know the person in your lab, Sally, but sometimes boundaries can become a dirty word because we've been in situations where they've been weaponized. And this idea that if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to cut you off, but we call that a boundary. I have to set up a boundary. So there's a fine line between doing what we feel is important for us and our own mental health and maybe being selfish. I think that's the concern with boundaries, is, am I being selfish? And we just want to name that can be a concern, that boundaries isn't just taking my ball and going home. That's a detachment. That's a distancing, which is still emotionally messy and confusing. So just know that you can weaponize boundaries. So we just want to make sure we put that in there to say, be thoughtful about how you set up boundaries. Be careful that it's not just a way to protect my emotions in an unhealthy way, but is actually going to be fruitful and helpful for everyone. So boundaries should be, as we'll see on this quote in just a second, and which is why I think it's a great quote, is it should be good for everyone in the long run. If we can imagine how me setting up this boundary because I'm over functioning for you will actually help you grow up and become more interdependent and more independent, that can be a really good boundary. But if I'm just doing it because I got my feelings hurt and I don't want to feel embarrassed and I'm just going to cut you off because you don't give me what you want, that's maybe weaponizing boundaries. So these 2 quotes here, just real quick, as again, why that's the idea of weaponizing it. I think this helps us balance that. As boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So again, it still is about love. And I like this quote, and we like it because it puts the love about mutuality. Boundaries is about looking at your good and my good. And sometimes boundaries are needed for both of our good. So the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And then secondly, teaching others how to respect your boundaries is important. Teaching yourself how to respect them is the life-changing part. That can be often the harder part, is how do we set up and respect our and other boundaries for ourselves. So.
Great. So now let's look at some practical tips and next steps related to boundaries. First one we have here is adopting a behavioral covenant. Again, if you've worked with us, this is one of the first things we do. And this is simply an agreement about how we're going to behave together, especially as adults. We have certain ways of behaving when we're kids and parents, but coming together, how we're going to do that. So we're going to actually review a few now and then come back to this. So these are just a few things we have on ours. And a key one is using I statements to bring our thoughts and feelings to the conversation. So I feel, I want, versus, we feel. That's that kind of enmeshment. Or you, using you statements, because that can really be more attacking or blaming. And then a second one, we ask clarifying questions to deepen our understanding. So this is all about curiosity. It's really bringing a posture of curiosity, not a know-it-all, but just really curious and open. And next, we agree to check on confidentiality. So we often do this at the end of our meetings and encourage you to do this as well when you meet, because sometimes things will be said that we want to, it would be good to share in correct ways, but we want to check on that. Very important. And number 4, we welcome appropriate humor. Now, we have this in here because sometimes families can use humor as a way to deflect. You know, we kind of make a joke out of things, so we don't really go into the serious or delicate nature. And sometimes it can also be used as a weapon. We will resist triangling in unhealthy ways. We will go direct with respect. So triangling, just a word about this. You know, if I have an issue with my brother, there might be a lot of anxiety in that for me, and maybe I want to avoid it, or maybe I want to attack him. But instead of having that conversation direct with him, I might go to my sister. So what that does, if I leave that with her, that takes all the anxiety off of me, it puts it on her, and I might feel like, oh, it's done, I talked about it. So one of the ways that we can de-triangle, if I go to my sister, she can say to me, you know what, you're triangling, or we actually have a symbol. Some of our families use this. Do it just a triangling symbol. And that can alert us that, you know, we really need to go direct with the other person.
And these are just, we wanted to give examples of, as you learn more about your family system, we encourage you to make your behavioral covenant your own. So we often have a template with kind of some of our best practices that we've learned over the years, but every family is different. And so these are a few examples of very specific family patterns that they recognized and they added to their behavioral covenant. One was, we agree not to say it's not rocket science. So that's often when they would be frustrated because what they thought was a simple decision, either in the family or the business, they would get frustrated. And somewhere along the way, this became the phrase that they used. It's not rocket science. And what that did was put everyone else on the defense, because what you're really saying is you're an idiot if you don't agree with me, because this seems like such a simple decision. So they put that on and recognized, oh, that's not a helpful thing for us. We have to kind of break that pattern. And another family was, once we were alerted to this, I was thinking through as they were meeting, I just kept hearing the same kind of things over and over. So I started actually I started counting how many times they asked leading questions in a meeting. And within about 15 minutes, they had asked about 10 leading questions. I mean, it was crazy. And a leading question was, I'm really trying to trap you into saying something. I'm not asking a genuine question. So they would say things like, well, someone would give their opinion and another brother would say, well, what do you think Dad would say about that? And they already know what they think Dad's going to say about that. They just want to test their brother. And then their brother says something they don't agree with and say, no, that's not what he would say. And then they give their opinion. And it's sort of like a gotcha moment. And that just broke down communication. So once I pointed it out to them, they were a little frustrated because they were like, oh my gosh, we're so distracted. Like we do this all the time. But it was a really good thing for them to put in the behavioral covenant. So just knowing your own family patterns, saying like, what do we do a lot that maybe we inherited from mom or dad or grandpa, or that maybe isn't helping us move along in our relationship? And can we name it, put it on the covenant to work on?
So back to some other practical tips. The second one here, use first names when talking about work. This seems like a simple one. Sometimes it's hard to do, but can be very effective. So instead of calling mom and dad at work, which really signifies to everyone around you that parent-child relationship and can really bring up feelings that aren't so positive around entitlement or things like that, you know, call your mom and dad, John and Mary, at work, which also will help you and them posture into a different role, and then use mom and dad at home. The next one, physically set apart your workspace from your living space. This can be really helpful for some families. Other families, myself included, I actually sometimes find it helpful to bring my work into the family room, because at least I'm part of the family and I can also do a little bit of work on the side. But again, this is a balance, a delicate one. Another one, journal to write down what you want for your life and your relationships. So take the time to think about what it is that you want. Can be very, very effective. Next one, as far as boundaries, learn to say no or not right now in gracious and emotionally neutral ways. That can really be hard for some families, but just that simple practicing of doing that can be very effective. And the last one we have jotted down here, there's a lot more, but write down what triangles exist in your family and how to go direct with love and respect. An example, agreeing to use this triangle symbol might be a good one. So a lot more we could talk about boundaries, but that's a good head start on that. So now we would like to move to resilience. How can we adapt our family to changing circumstances? So a definition here, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. How do we move through adversity? And we are all facing adversity at this time. There are dark times, but how can we come out stronger as a family? So we have a slide here on what resilient families are able to do. Again, here's just a short list, and maybe you can talk about some of these in family meetings. The first is distinguishing between thinking and feeling and using that ability to resolve issues. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit, but one of the ways to do that, because the family, again, is this emotional unit, is to use phrases like, how am I contributing to this? What is my responsibility in that? Because it takes us away from the emotion. So resilient families are able to keep a strong desire to connect while respecting individual decisions. We'll talk about that later. And also find ways to be supportive without controlling. I'm just going to say a word about this because struggle is really important in the development of people and also in animals. Many of you know about the butterfly, what happens when they're trying to struggle out of a cocoon. It takes struggle. If we try to help the butterfly get out, the butterfly actually will never be able to fly. So we have to be able to allow our children to go through pain and struggle. That's how they grow. And the next one, become a healthy family of adults. A word here. This is especially a tricky one for family businesses because we start off as a parent and a child. Every family starts this way, right? There's a power dynamic. And the parent is always teaching the child. So as we move towards a family of adults, the parent needs to move down to be an adult, and the child needs to move up to be an adult. So we need to learn how to be an adult together. And another word here we put here is roots to wings. In our families, we give roots, like values, but then the process of letting go and allowing our children to fly. Another thing resilient families are able to do is directly discuss disruptions and changes to the family.
Yeah. And only thing I would mention too, if you're looking for resources on this idea of finding ways to be supportive without controlling, the work of Jessica Leahy she has a book called The Gift of Failure, where she talks about the education system and teaching and allowing kids to fail as they're learning. And then in parenting, Megan McArdle also has a lot of work on that. So that'd be two resources for that. So being able to directly discuss disruptions and changes to the family, that can be hard. Again, it's about having these difficult conversations can be a good theme of everything we're talking about in resilient families can sit down and look at each other in the eye and say, this seems to be changing in our relationship. I like it, or I don't like it, or here's my concerns, or here's my questions, instead of what we maybe often do, which is stuff it or pretend it's not there. And then we see that that's not resiliency, that's just denial, and it'll come out later in not so great ways. And then be open. This is really hard. Be open to relationships changing as roles change. And what we see, in our 5 principles, the rising generation stepping up means a lot of those role changes means they have to take more responsibility. They have to step up. They have to learn how to be adults and know that, mom and dad may not always be the backstop or the support system. In fact, as you age, you may end up being that for your parent. And so there's that stepping up, but also recognizing from the leading gen and the older people in the family that to be, as Sally mentioned, you may have been surprised to say they have to step down to be the parent or to be an adult. And a lot of times that's because the parent is the superhero, the one that can do no wrong and doesn't make mistakes. We have to kind of learn as kids grow up that we're peers on some level in that way. And there's always those dynamics, and there'll always be a parent. But being able to recognize there is a loss of that power and control that you used to have when they were 10, that now maybe you don't have as much when they're 18 or 20 or 30 or 40. So being open to how those relationships change and being able to talk about them is what resilient families are able to do. Another big change is when first round draft picks come in. And we see that a lot. There's a challenge there where moms used to being able to take care of their sons and make them lunch every day. And we had a family where mom was still making lunch every day for the sons at work. And the spouses were like, hey, that's kind of stepping into our territories. And we encourage them to have that conversation. That's a changing role. And then lastly, practice the platinum rule. It's something we've been using more and more. The golden rule is very appropriate, and it's very adequate when we're talking to strangers. It's a great baseline. And the golden rule, of course, is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It's a great starting place. What we've realized is the problem with that is it assumes that what other people need is what I need, and that other people see things the way I see things. And as we've learned, that can be a challenge. We've had family businesses where there was a lot of tension and they couldn't figure out why. Like, we're just practicing the golden rule. Well, it's because you're individuals. You're different. You have different needs. So yeah, I would want my brother to come and give me the verbal vomit in the office every day. So I'm just being kind to practice the golden rule. Well, the other brother's like, well, I'm not like you. So the platinum rule is do to others what they have told you they want done to them or they need done to them. So again, that's a better rule for family and those people you're in close relationship is have the conversation and say, is how I'm treating you, does it feel respectful? Does it feel loving? Is it meeting your needs? Is it what you need? So maybe upgrading for family and those close to you from the golden rule to the platinum rule.
And that's great for parents when you're young. You can start teaching your kids that now. That's another reason why we do assessments, because in order to know ourselves and know each other, we often have to do that deeper work. So now we want to step into some practical tips and next steps for being resilient. Start trying to name your feelings and hearing others without judgment, building family muscle, practicing better communication, and practicing good apologies. So we have a slide on each one of these.
Yeah, taking a few minutes here. So trying to better name your feelings is funny. We've been meeting, Sally and Henry, actually, our founder, and I have been meeting around this too, of just how important it is for people to be able to name their feelings. So we have what we call a feelings wheel, which feels a little juvenile, but it's so helpful because so much of we're so unpracticed at this. And it literally is a wheel that has a bunch of words for feelings. And sometimes in meetings, it's helpful to bring that out and say, how are you feeling? I don't know. Like, let me look at this and see if I identify with one of these words. So we'd have to be able to even have the language to name our feelings, which we're often missing. But this idea of FAM is important, and that's that feelings are messengers. So when we're growing up, we might have been told, don't cry, like, whatever, boys don't cry, or some way of thinking about our emotions or our feelings as good or bad. And really they're neutral. They're often messengers trying to tell us that something's happening in our life. And so it's important that we listen to them and not judge our feelings, but just be able to name them so that we can say, oh, well, what's it trying to tell me? When I'm sad, when I'm crying, when I'm upset, when I'm angry, when I'm afraid, what's it trying to tell me? That's helpful. There's a reason we have those feelings. They give us good messages. And then secondly, understand your tendency. And this is bringing in Susan David's book, our theme book, called Emotional Agility, which Sally will talk more about in a little bit. But she has these 3 tendencies in her book. She talks about that instead of naming and talking about our feelings, some of us bottle it. So the repressors, these tend to be the people who can be a little explosive because they bottle it for so long, and then something completely unrelated, the kids, you can't find the remote because the kids hide it and they blow up. You're like, that was outsized. Like, why am I getting so upset about that? It's because you've been bottling these other emotions from these other things, and then something triggers it. So we have bottlers and we have brooders. Those tend to be those processors, the people who just keep talking about it, even when no one's there, right? So if you find yourself having a lot of wonderful conversations in the shower by yourself with other people who aren't actually there, you're probably a brooder, the kind of person who's like always trying to figure it out and have those conversations. And well, if I would, now that I'm thinking about it, this is what I should have said. And you kind of just keep brooding on that. And then the bypassers. And these are the people who tend to want to bypass the negative feelings. So they tend to just put a positive spin on everything. Well, it's not as bad as it seems. It's a little bit more of a denial. instead of truly tapping into, no, I'm really mad about this, we sort of justify, well, it's not that bad, or, this, I look at the bright side, right? So the bypassers tend to always look at the bright side, which there's positive to that, but not if it's keeping us from actually tapping into how we're really feeling. And then the last thing is practice being curious, which Sally, you mentioned earlier for the behavioral covenant. I like to say, one of my phrases I like to say is, curiosity and judgment make poor roommates. It's really hard to be judgmental when I'm being curious. So the more curiosity I found, the less judgment. And so being curious about your emotions, not judging them as good or bad, but just saying, I wonder what it is. I wonder where it came from. I wonder what it's trying to tell me, rather than jumping to, I shouldn't feel. So we get the shoulds in there a little too quickly.
And by the way, we're going to be focusing a lot on this in September. Jared and I are going to be doing a whole forum on emotional agility. So we'll get into this deeper. So another way to build resilience is building family muscle. And again, as I talked about earlier, that healthy families are the foundation of a healthy business. It is the farm team into management, maybe the board work and shareholder work. So some ideas here. Having family dinners with no phones or work talk. Have you tried that? If you haven't, that can be a really good opportunity to put an appropriate boundary around family and really hear from each other's hearts, to really hear closely. So that might also be in your behavioral covenant. Next, scheduling one-to-one time or two-to-two time, say if maybe two couples with family members, not just group time. So it's important to have like all the extended family together, but when we really can be vulnerable with each other, it's really maybe having a regular lunch with all of my kids, maybe not with my spouse sometimes, and maybe sometimes with my spouse, but finding those smaller times to connect, we find it is really powerful. That's often in our action steps with family business. Find time to connect outside of business where you can just talk one-to-one or two-to-two. Family newsletters is another great way to build family muscle. Some of you heard Mitzi Perdue when we had her a few years ago at our forum. She shared excellent examples. And also Amy Ginder from Funland shared last, I think it was September, talked about the value of them doing fun family newsletters in their business. And lastly, building family muscle, especially during this COVID time. Technology has been awesome. Jared, you want to talk about Marco Polo?
Yeah, I'll talk about Marco Polo and a group text thing that just came to mind. But yeah, as our family, we use Marco Polo, which has been great. And this has been helpful for me because I am so bad at texting. I have every intention, but then I have to have like a quiet space, and I really just don't like it. Maybe I'm just too lazy to sit and type out things with my thumbs. But Marco Polo is just an app where it's basically like a video chat where instead of texting, you just record these short messages, and the person can get it whenever they are ready to get it. So it's really helped our family. I mean, we've been talking over the last month way more than we normally would because it's so easy to pick up my phone. It's awkward at first. My mom did not like it. She was like, what is this? I can't talk back to you. Let's just get up on FaceTime. But now she's like the most avid user of Marco Polo. So it's just an app where I can pick up the phone. I can hit record. It's a video. I can just say, hey, how's it going? This was my day. How was your day? Tell me a little bit about it. I stop it, and then they get it whenever they can, and they respond. And yeah, it's a pretty fun way to do that. The only thing I would say with group text, because I was thinking of a family even before this, there was a group of about 6 or 7 in a generation that were working together. They didn't have time to connect outside of work, they felt like. And we gave a simple suggestion at a family, it was G3 family meeting. Hey, right now, everyone get out your phone. Let's make sure everyone has a phone, and let's designate one person to send a group text. And it became their G3 group text. And the last year, it revolutionized their relationship. It was really it ended up being a really good decision for them. And they, even now, that this was a year and a half ago, I'll ask the family members from time to time, like, how's that group? Oh, it's so great. They just drop in updates. So that's one example where it really made a difference. And they were, all in their they were teenagers and 20 something.
So our family, like maybe your family, has been doing a lot of FaceTime. We've been doing a lot of Zoom. Jared and I do it a lot in our work, but to bring our family into that was a new thing. I do it with my sisters, with my mom, that side, and also with our kids. And another example is tiny beans. I tell this to every new parent or grandparent. Our daughter started this when our granddaughter was born 2.5 years ago, and every day she puts on pictures and videos. And so, and it's for whoever she wants to include, but it's our whole family. And so it's really a muscle building, resilience building thing. So I'm going to show you some pictures here from, this is actually my granddaughter. Had to get her in here somehow because she's really what I miss the most, that physical interaction. So these are some pictures that have been on Tiny Beans. I love the one that's actually shaving cream on the right. Doesn't that show resilience? They were having craft time with shaving cream. And then the one on the right corner at the bottom, that's a family Zoom where we actually put our pets up and had our pets do a little conversation. So you can have a lot of fun with this, and I'm sure your families are doing that as well. So next, we want to talk about practicing better communication. Just to review some of this, practicing the platinum rule, which is, asking what do people need and saying what we need. So again, it's treating people the way they want to be treated. Establishing a behavioral covenant. If you'd like, ask us. We'll send you a template that has some ideas. Do less triangling. Go direct with respect. Use the symbol. And then establishing a mutual purpose. We talked about this a lot last year. Our theme book last year was Crucial Conversations. And one of the key points out of there is starting one of these crucial conversations with coming up with a mutual purpose together. What is it we want out of this conversation? And it could be as simple as, we really care about each other and we want this, whatever we decide, to be in our both of our best interests. We don't want to hurt the relationship.
Another tip here too is using less disclaimers. And really what that means is, if we have something hard to share, we like to maybe soften it with we don't want to be harsh. And so we soften our language. The challenge with that is sometimes it feels like backpedaling, and that can be confusing. Like, wait, are you telling me that what I'm doing is annoying? Or are you not telling me that? Because the way you're talking about it, you're providing a disclaimer is like, well, this is what I'm thinking, but it's really not that bad. Like, yeah, you are being annoying. And then, so the backpedaling part is usually we come out strong. Yeah, when you do that, it's pretty annoying. And then we see someone feeling hurt. And so we start to backpedal, say, oh, well, it's not that bad. And it's not, and then by the end, we may even talk ourselves completely out of it. It really was my fault. It's all on me, actually. And then we kick ourselves after that conversation because we know in a month we're going to have the same conversation because we weren't clear. So use less disclaimers, say what you need to say, and then we can deal and talk, and you can still emphasize I love you and care about you without backpedaling maybe the feedback that you're giving. And then the next one is using contrasting. And this has been a really helpful tool for a lot of our families. And that is because sometimes we'll say, well, why don't you share this with the person you're talking about? Well, I think they'll take it this way. And so contrasting is, we'll just preempt that. Say, hey, I know there's a concern or a fear that I have that maybe you'll take it this way. That's not my intention. My intention really is, and then go this way. So it's contrasting. This is what I don't want out of this conversation. This is what I really hope for. So I'm hoping that this doesn't lead to us disconnecting. I'm really hoping that it leads to us connecting more. I really don't want this to hurt your feelings. That's not my intention, but I do think I need to share. So that's 2 examples of contrasting. And then last is being open about fears and past experiences. So if you recognize a pattern of, hey, I feel like I've tried to share this before, and when I do, you get your feelings hurt and you take your ball and go home, and then it becomes about you instead of me and the hurt that maybe you've caused me. So that's my fear in having this conversation with you. So that seems like a lot. It's a very vulnerable position to be in, but a lot of these do require some vulnerability.
So we've just given you a lot of information. Maybe just to review this next slide, some of what we just, jumping.
Sorry, just the last one, because we often, resilient families, we find practice good apologies. It's amazing. Frankly, some of the families we talk to, I asked them, I was just talking to a family maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and I just said, I recognize a pattern in their generation. I said, how many times do you remember your dad apologizing to you as a kid? Not one time, none of them. I don't think my dad ever apologized to me. So either he wasn't good at that or he was perfect. And I can tell you probably which one that it was. So practicing good apologies is a really important part of resilience as a family, because we're going to upset each other. If you're in a family business, it's a guarantee. You're going to be stepping on each other's toes. You're going to be hurting each other. So we have to get good at apologizing. And so just some key tips. A lot of the experts will say there's really 3 parts: express remorse, accept responsibility, offer to improve. How that happens, there's many ways. So here are some, on the plus side, here's kind of a 5-step model that you can learn from here. I'm sorry that and then say, I'm sorry that I hurt you. I'm sorry that I offended you. This was my intention. Here's where my intention got mixed up. Here's where I was wrong. I'll work on doing it better next time. Will you forgive me? Now, what we usually start out that way, but then we slide over to the negatives when we start apologizing. So these are really unhelpful ways to apologize. These aren't really apologies. I'm sorry if I offended you. Well, that leaves open the question that maybe I did, maybe I didn't. It's like, well, if we're having the conversation, I did. I'm sorry that I hurt you. Not, I'm sorry if I hurt you. I'm sorry that you. That's also not a good helpful one. I'm sorry that you were offended. Or I'm sorry, but. I'm sorry that I did it, but really it's your fault, is usually how people hear that. So if we can avoid those ifs, that, yous, and buts, and just stick to, I'm sorry that I hurt you. My intention wasn't to hurt you. I misunderstood what you were saying. This is how I was thinking about it. I'll work on better next time. Will you forgive me? So it's good. Practice it in the mirror. Be good.
Practice makes perfect. Or actually, practice doesn't make perfect. We're always, progress is better. Progress, not perfection.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about these different things. I'm gonna just skip this slide because we talked about all of that, and then just move on. This is also a poem. I'm not going to read it. Maybe you've heard it. It's "And the People Stayed Home." It was written by someone actually during this crisis, and might be something for you to share, but I'm not going to go into it because of time. So our last slide, just some invitations that we would extend to you. Beth probably already sent you a brief evaluation, just 3 questions. It would really help us if you would respond to that so we can continue to serve you and serve you well. Next one is for you to reflect on what we talked about today and maybe consider sharing some of your thoughts or ideas at a family meeting. Also a reminder that these will be on our website, and that's the link. The next, if you haven't already scheduled your 90-minute family business consult, we're doing that. We're doing that by Zoom, and hopefully we'll be able to do that in person as well. But if you haven't scheduled that, just reach out to us. It comes with your membership. You've all received the membership book, Emotional Agility. I encourage you to read that. Our team, we've been reading that several times. Lots of good stuff. And then lastly, some of our upcoming events. March 14, our webinar is going to be about leadership agility. Greg McCann is coming back. He presented back in 2007. It's going to be very worthwhile, and our member highlight is going to be Robert Berge. Robert's the G3 president of Berge's Electric. He will also be sharing a bit. And then September 17 is our focus on building emotional agility. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continued connections with you. Best for your day. Jared, do you have a goodbye as well?
Yep. We'll see you later. Hopefully see you May and September for sure.
Thank you.